Quad66. So I'm revisiting the bench data on the GepRC 1202 motor, specifically an 8000 kV motor. We've gone over this motor before. I kind of talked about it before because it was sort of what I found to be the closest in terms of replacement for the AMAX motor, where you have kind of a fairly lightweight, good all-around sort of performance motor, not necessarily shining in any one particular category, but being pretty well balanced. But I had some problems when I started flying this motor initially with a lot of wobbles, and I kind of put it to the side for a while. But then when I did that T-motor review in terms of the bench testing, I got kind of interested by this data, sort of piqued my interest again. And so I went back and worked it out in terms of, can I get this to fly well? And so I have been able to get this to fly pretty well, mainly by getting really aggressive with the P's. You can see the P's I've pushed all the way up here into the 70s, and the usual kind of pretty high feed forward. D's relatively high, but not insane. Really the standout kind of value there's the P. But with those values, I've been able to get this motor to fly pretty well. I'll do another video kind of talking about the tune in detail. But you can see here, so here's our set point in green and then our gyro in purple. Basically what we want to see is we want to see our gyro really follow that set point and not come off the set point much at all. And I ultimately did get it there. It's still got some issues. I'll go through those. It has like these little bobbles, it gets little oscillations. But the way to get it there was actually to do this, to get really aggressive with the tune in terms of letting the gyro overshoot here. So here's our set point. This is a full snap roll. So here we're going full roll and then full off back to neutral, and that's the green, the set point. And you can see the gyro here jumps nicely with the set point, stays pretty parallel. And then you have to let it overshoot, and you oftentimes, like in some of these, you'll see that there's even a little P oscillation. You're going to get some P oscillation on high throttle, but at the end of the day, this is the tune that kind of locked this quad in and sort of brought these motors to life for me on this quad. So because I'm pretty happy with this, I think this is a good option. So I figured kind of get this tune dialed up, get this where I can release this for you to copy it or use it, and use that on your Warpig if you're going to build that up, or similar builds like that. So going back to the data then for this motor. So talking about thrust, this motor is okay on thrust. It's definitely not as good as any of these ringer motors in terms of the thrust. So we got that Happy Model 1203 motor. We got I think it's the Mamba motor over here, the Apex motor. These motors are really going to outpace this motor on thrust. But the GepRC motor, although it kind of looks towards the bottom here, it's better than all these other kind of reasonably efficient motors. So it really does beat out these other, like the GepRC 1103, that Bard 1103, beats out that Beta FPV, beats out the Jing motor. And it does so, where it kind of starts to shine is in the efficiency. So the thrust isn't overly remarkable, but the efficiency starts to really come up to the top of the surface here. And really the only motors that it's less in efficiency are going to be some of those motors that really give up quite a bit of thrust. Again, those are the motors I just went through with the GepRC, the Beta FPV motor, the Bard motor, etc. So in terms of looking at that same data with some bar plots here, so when we look at the thrust on this GepRC motor, you can see it's kind of like below average, when we throw in these ringer motors, but compared to these other, motors, the thrust really isn't that bad. And compared to that AMAX motor, yes, it gives up a little bit of thrust, but not very much at all. Then when we look at the efficiency actually looks quite good. The only motors that are doing better efficiency-wise are really these motors that give up quite a bit of thrust, the Bard, the Beta FPV motor, and that GepRC motor. And this motor, this GepRC, does do better than the AMAX motor, does better than that Jing motor, and certainly does quite a bit better than any of these like ringer kind of motors with like So here's that happy model, 1203, the Apex motor, that 1202.6, and where's the Mamba? The Mamba over here. You can see that it's going to be quite a bit more efficient than all of those higher thrust motors. In terms of where does it produce its efficiency, it's actually pretty neutral. It's not biased towards high RPMs, not biased towards low RPMs. And so that's kind of what you want. It means that this is pretty well matched to the prop. The motor's not drawing too much down low, and it's not overly bogging down up top. Then when we go into the step response, so this is that dynamic response. This is when we go from 10% throttle up to 30% throttle, and here's how much of a jump it makes. And this is basically kind of proportional to the thrust. And so you can see the GepRC 1202, that 8000 kV motor. It's kind of middle of the road here, and that's to be expected because this is just going to be proportional to thrust. So the more thrust you can make, the bigger of a jump you're going to make when you do that step response. Then how well that step response locks in. So how steep is that curve, and how well does it plateau out? This is theoretically what should give you good control over the prop. This motor does pretty well. You can see that it's up there, a little bit better than the AMAX motor in terms of kind of these other pure motors. Yeah, not quite as good as that Hot model, and not quite as good as that Brother Hobby, but it's in the realm of locking in better than any motors that are going to be like kind of more efficient, and really only gives up a little bit to some of the better motors on that. So in terms of what does that mean overall, I talked about this before. So this is kind of a radar chart where we look at these different factors. We look at the lightness, the thrust. Lightness is just the negative of weight, basically putting a negative sign on weight so that you're penalized if you weigh more. So lightness, the thrust, the efficiency, that step gain, how big of a step it makes when you go from 10 to 30% throttle, and how well does it lock in. So in black is that sort of benchmark motor, that's that AMAX motor. And you can see that our GepRC motor does well on the lightness. They advertise it as a 3.8 gram motor, so a sub 4 gram motor, and I think that's pretty accurate on the actual scale. It is a little bit lighter than an AMAX motor. Gives up a little bit in thrust to the AMAX motor, but then picks up in efficiency and also picks up in terms of the lock. So overall, that AMAX motor is not available. GepRC is, and so if you want a replacement, this is about, I think, as close as you're going to get. In terms of other motors that I'm kind of interested in, the other one I'll throw up here, let's run this one more time, is the LDA-REC motor. So now, when we throw in the LDA-RC motor, we can see that we've got quite a different motor. The LDA-RC motor is still pretty decent in terms of weight. It's actually lighter than the AMAX motor. And it's going to produce even more thrust than the AMAX motor. But it does give up quite a bit of efficiency. And then this part, I'm going to do a separate video to really dive into this, but I don't know what entirely happened here, why this motor tested so poorly on the step response. It kind of had this big jump, but then it didn't lock in. It kind of just took forever to plateau. And that, I don't know if I necessarily feel with that. I feel that in the air. I don't know if I fully agree with that. But it's a little bit hard to sort of recommend this motor when we've got two factors. Efficiency, I agree with this. This is definitely not the most efficient motor. And then, am I just kidding myself that I think that this motor flies better than it does? I think, to me, it tuned up well and it flies really well, but this was a little bit kind of concerning of not knowing why this LDA-RC kind of fell off here in terms of how well it locks in and what that means. Other motors maybe that you would compare this to, I think the Xing motors, the 1103s, have been available, so that's maybe another good comparison. So now the Xing motors in the green, you can see weight-wise pretty comparable between the GepRC in red and the Xing motor in green. The Jing, however, gives up even more thrust, and this is pushing me, the Jing, I think the GepRC is basically the low end of thrust that I find kind of like that I think you want for this sort of build. So the Jing, I think, kind of falls a little bit probably below that. It's not necessarily any better on efficiency, and then it doesn't necessarily lock in any better. Overall, though, I think that Jing motor is, it's not terrible, you know. You're just kind of giving up a little bit more thrust than I would like without really picking up much efficiency in that trade-off. You know, obviously now if we compare this to like some of the ringer motors that are out there, you know, like for example, how would this compare to where was that, Apex? I mean, Apex motor, it's not available right now, so it's not really even a fair comparison. You know, to say how does this motor compare to the Apex? But just for the sake of argument here, we can see now it's just a, you know, the Apex motor is just kind of a different class motor where it's heavier, it's a bigger, heavier motor, definitely has more thrust, but gives up quite a bit in terms of the efficiency. Makes a bigger jump on the step gain, but doesn't lock in. So it makes a bigger jump when you go from 10 to 30%, but doesn't plateau, doesn't lock in quite as well. So it's a little bit different motor. And I think the other motor that's out there and pretty common, people are using it for better or worse, and I think for that reason it's probably worth doing a quick comparison. I think this is the last one I'll do here. This beta FPV motor. And so now we can see something, the beta FPV motor definitely is like doing some different things here where it's a light motor, and that's definitely an advantage to it, but I'm kind of guessing it might be light to the point of being too, you know, kind of fragile for the way I fly. You're giving up some thrust, but you are getting some efficiency. And then in terms of that step gain, not locking in very well, so probably not controlling these props very well. And when you go put these two data points together with, you know, a lot of efficiency but not locking in well, you know, maybe that makes for this beta FPV motor here in green to be a good cruiser. But in terms of like backyard performance kind of flyer, you know, acro racing kind of thing, I don't think that beta FPV motor is going to be the motor you want. So, you know, we kind of had this conclusion before. I think this GepRC motor is a very interesting motor. I think it's kind of like for, just because we don't really have other options, it is ultimately kind of the successor to the AMAX motor. And I broke something, so now it's mad. Oh, that's what I broke. So ultimately, you know, performance-wise, at least on the bench testing, it's the successor to that AMAX motor. And I think flying it in the backyard, I think I agree with that. Now that I have this motor a little bit dialed in, it took some, you know, some different tuning, but you know, it's now pretty dialed in, and I'm looking pretty happy there. And also, kind of interestingly, I haven't finished the tune on 3S yet, but the at least start of tuning on the 3S, it looks like it'll do pretty well there too. Okay, I'm also going to do a separate video to go into what the tune itself looks like, and I'll go through a couple of like little downsides that I can't seem to get rid of in the tune, but nothing horrible. And so keep your eyes open for that video. The other one I'll do is the LDARC bench testing as well. Okay, till next time, cheers.